Hi there, I'm Eric Rhodes with Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and Streamline Art. Thank you for watching today. We've got a great new video for you. It's called The 6 Elements of Design, and it's with Mary Garrish. I think you're going to enjoy this segment.
Hi, my name is Mary Garrish and I'm a landscape painter, and I'm thrilled to be here today making this video with you. So what we're going to delve into is the art of design. Design obviously is very crucial for any painting that you're going to make. And there are 6 elements to design: line, shape, color, value, texture, and edges. That's a lot to think about when you're making a painting all at one time. So we're going to break it down and simplify it and study each thing individually. There was an article that I read a while back that I thought really pertained to art. And what it did was talked about how artists, when you're making a painting, that is performance, and how we need to really study a lot more before we go into the art of performance. They likened it to professional athletes who, leading up to a game, they have spent many more hours practicing, and only then do they go to the art of performance, which is actually playing the game. I have really started to do that, and I think that it has really helped me progress in my artwork. So today I'm going to show you my method, and I hope that you like it. So let's go on to materials and tools. Okay, so now we're going to talk about materials and tools, and I'd like to start with my brushes. Of course, I have a variety of brushes. I have some bristle brushes, and I have some like hog's hair brushes. And as far as brushes go, I think it's kind of like chocolates, that, you know, it's a very personal choice, or like perfume. You know, you really have to be attuned to what your tools do for you and what you want them to do. So I'm not one that when I teach a workshop, I tell my students, oh, you have to have this brush or that brush. So when I first started painting, I didn't have a clue what any of these brushes did. And when I was painting, I wasn't really paying attention. So what I would say to you is actually do an exercise, mix up a bunch of paint, and just see what each individual brush does for you and how it lays the paint on. So that's my recommendation as far as brushes go. Obviously, I start with big ones and I go to little ones. So this is Neo McGilp. There are lots of different mediums out there. It just depends on what works for you. And I happen to like this one a lot. It helps make the paint move around well, and it helps with the drawing process. I have my paints out here. I love the Sari paint. Yes, it is expensive, but it is pure pigment. And so I think in the long run, you actually end up saving money. So today, the colors that I'm going to use to paint the painting, I'm going to use a very limited palette because this is a nocturne and I want it to be very harmonious and cohesive. So I have out cadmium lemon. I have out yellow ochre, which is a neutral yellow. I have out Venetian red, which is a neutral red. And I have cobalt out. And the reason I'm using cobalt and not ultramarine is I have a very bad habit of painting too darkly. And ultramarine really makes me paint way too darkly. So I might sneak a little bit of that out there at the end for some dark accents. But for my painting, what I've squirted out now are those 4 colors and white. And I have my mineral spirits. I have my palette knife, and again, I think that's a very individual thing. I think it's worth spending a little bit more on a palette knife, and you know, you want a little bit of play in it, but you know, not too much. And I kind of like a sharp tip. This I will use when I'm doing my washing, and I want to make sure my lines are in the proper place. This is just an old room key from a hotel, and it's great for just scraping down paint, and very cheap. And then the last thing that I love this, whether a plein air painter or a studio painter, this is called Marvelous Mary Savvy Soap. And it is a hand cleaner and a brush cleaner. And what's wonderful about it, especially in the field, is that you do not need soap. So I clean my brushes as well as I can in my mineral spirits, and I wipe them up with the paper towel. I squirt this in the paper towel, and then I put my brush into the soap and kind of squeeze it with the paper towel, and you would be amazed how much more paint comes out. And then I leave a little bit in, and it conditions it, especially the tip. So this is fantastic stuff, and no, I don't have stock in it. There's a product out there called Cold Wax by Gamblin, and if you've never played around with it, I suggest that you do. It's a great method to put a lot of texture into your paintings. All you do is scoop it out and you add a certain amount to the pile of paint that you already have mixed up. You can add at least up to 50% paint and cold wax. And what this does is just give great texture to the areas, especially of interest, that you want to emphasize. I don't use it so much in the areas where I have my darks, but I do use it a lot in my midtones and my lights around the focal point. It's very easy to use, and it actually speeds up drying. And so I'm going to show you how I have mixed up a tone here, a darker tone, and I'm going to add a bunch of cold wax to that, which really extends the paint. It does make it a little bit more matted, which I hope you can see here on the video. So that might be a plus or a minus. So now I'm going to put some also in my lighter tone that I've mixed up here. And you can put a lot of cold wax in there. You can put like up to, I've done up to 50% cold wax. So it's really nice to get a lot of texture. So there are multiple different ways that you can apply the paint. First I'll show you with just a brush. So I've picked up a good amount of paint here, and it goes on very nicely. And so what's good about this is you can really design your brush strokes. That's one of the things I love about it. And obviously build up the paint quickly. Now I'm going to show you a brayer. And if you're really covering a large surface, certainly the brayer is a way to go. So here's my brayer, and I'm picking up the paint here. And just for contrast, I have a lightly toned surface here, so I'm going to put it on the lightly toned surface. And it's also gessoed, so it's going to pick up the paint differently. It's a very creative surface. So now I can come in. I don't know what this little tool is called. I think they used it for sculpting, but it's got a little plastic tip on it. You can use either end if you want to. And then you can come in and kind of carve back out your lights. Lots of fun. Okay, so now we're going to break down the elements of design, and the first thing we're going to do is start with line, because it all starts with an interesting line. So I've got to decide here with my pencil, I've got to decide first what size canvas I'm going to have. So is it going to be vertical? Is it going to be square? Is it going to be horizontal? And this is going to be mostly about the sky, and it's going to be a nocturne. So I think I want to go with a vertical. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to explore with the pencil in my sketchbook what a square would look, because sometimes I really surprise myself. Here are my reference photos. This is a nocturne photo that I took, but I photoshopped it onto a different marsh because I like the reflections in the water, and I liked a little bit the marsh, but I will redesign that also. This is another photo reference that I just liked the shapes of the clouds. So now we'll start to work with the pencil and decide on lines. So the first one I did, thinking that I wanted it probably to be vertical, this is a 2.5 by 2. And so that would translate into like a 20 by 16 painting. So here I have drawn in my lines. This would be the cloud. This would be the sky peeking through. This is my marsh area with the water. And I didn't like this design in the sky because it was too much 50-50. So then I moved on to another one and I lessened the color of the sky peeking through and made the clouds bigger. Now, I'm not working on nice shape making now. I'm strictly working on placement. If I was working on shape making, I would make these lines much more interesting. So when I go down to here, this is a square, and I just felt like the whole design was just a little bit too crowded. So then when I picked, this was my favorite sketch. When I picked that, I decided to go on and isolate the task of value, which I've done here with my value markers. They come in a pack of 12, the Prismacolor markers. And I have pulled out a 20%, a 50%, and an 80%. So the 20% I have used on the sky that is peeking through the clouds. My 50% is the cloud pattern, and then my 80% is the ground plane. My sky will always be lighter than the ground plane. And then I actually have, it's a Sharpie marker that is white. I use that to put in the highlight and reflecting down into the water a little bit. So the focal point is just off of center. So when I do get to the easel, I'm going to have to be very careful about making sure that my cloud doesn't grow and end up smack dab in the center, which I'm very capable of doing. Okay, so now we're back at the easel. And when we were in the sketchbook, we were isolating line, placement, and shapes to a certain degree, which are the first two elements of design. Shapes, actually, we will continue to modify throughout the entire painting. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to value and color. First, over here on the left is a very quick little plein air study that I did, just trying to get in color notes. It was in my front yard, it was nighttime, and it was a full moon, and so I was trying to just capture the color of the moon lighting up the sky that was peeking through the clouds. So this was a quick and dirty study, not a painting, and I used that to influence where my painting wanted to go when I went into the studio. So then, like in the sketchbook with the markers, I had an idea of where I wanted to go, how I'm going to break it down into just 3 values. So where are my darkest darks going to be, where are my midtones going to be, and where are my lights going to be? And you want to make sure that you have unequal distribution of those values. You don't want 30, 30, 30 because that's really pretty boring. And so what I've designed here is, it is more a mid-tone painting. They're probably more about 60%. The darks are about 20 and the lights are about 20. And then we may have some dark accents, and we will have a light accent or highlight, which will actually be the moon, kind of rim lighting the backlit cloud. Okay, so here I have started with darker values. And I thought I'm going to do 2 studies, one with it darker and then lighten it up a little bit and see which I like the most. So I've used these Portland Grays by Gamlin. There's a light, a medium, and a dark. Now you can also add black to these to make it even darker, or you can add white to lighten them up if you want a more high-key painting. So in this study, what I did was I used Portland Medium, Portland Dark, and I added black for the 3rd value. So the sky value is Portland Medium, the cloud value is Portland Deep, and then for the darks, I added deep with some black. The next study down here, I actually just used the 3 grays out of the tube. And so once I decided that I liked the lighter one better, then I decided to go and do a color study of it. I did a color study, the darker one, just for the video here today, and I wanted you to see that it really helps to decide on your values without the color. This is much easier to see the proportions and make sure that you have unequal distribution of values. Okay, so here I have used lemon yellow, ochre, Venetian red, and cobalt. And I have mixed up the colors here, and so I'm going to show you how you can check your values to your gray value study. Okay, so I'm going to start with this medium tone here that's in the cloud. And so I'm going to put it in here, and as you can see, it disappears into that value. There's not an edge. So you know you're spot on with that value. Now I'm going to get my ground plane here and put that in, and you see again, it has disappeared. So this tone and this tone are the same value. And I did that to limit my values. So the cloud value and the light on the marsh are the same value. Now I'm going to go into the sky value, and make sure that your brush is always clean anytime you go into the sky. And there you go. If you squint down, it just melds into the value. And then there's a dark value here, which goes into our dark. So 3 values, 1, 2, and 3. So I decided I like this value setting better instead of the darker one. And now I decided to do one more study, just playing with a different palette. And I used the same colors, but I added in Indian yellow. And this is the painting that I came up with. It has the same value structure, but just a different palette. I wanted to make it more about the yellows. And I think I like this so much, I think I'm going to do a future painting with that. So now that you've seen how I study value and color, we're going to go ahead and go into the wash-in for the next phase. Okay, so now let's go on to the wash-in. So my painting is mostly cool tones. So I'm going to do a warm underpainting so that you get some vibration there. But first I'm going to work on the placement of my lines so that I make sure they're in exactly where I want them to be. So the horizon line in my sketchbook was about 20% of the way up. And since this is 20 inches tall, the horizon line is going to be about 5 inches. So that's the first line that I want to put in. And I am right-handed. And if I just put in one line at 5 inches and I don't put another one over here, my horizon line is going to slant just like that. And I have done it so many times I can't begin to tell you. So I always make sure now I measure on both sides so that I have a straight horizon line. Okay, now the next line I'm going to measure is where my focal point is going to be. And it's about 7 down and 7 across. So why is that important? Because I want to make sure it is not in the center. And oftentimes I will, instead of drawing center lines, oftentimes I will cut the canvas into thirds. But because of this design, I was really worried that I would put it smack dab in the center. And especially whether it's trees or clouds or whatever it is, sometimes the form tends to grow. So I'm going to make sure that I don't go to the right of this line here. And so now I'm going to start putting in with the pencil just some general lines, just to kind of give me a clue where I'm going with the cloud versus the sky and the marsh. And I'm not really taking great care about my shapes right now. These are just general lines that I will use at the beginning. The real shape making comes when I start dealing with edges. And so this is the distant shore, and I want to make it somewhat interesting. Now in my marsh, I'm going to have some directional lines which will lead me into the center of interest, which is where the reflection, my highlight's going to be around in here, and the reflection is going to come down here. So I want to make sure that I have that open, because I want the reflection coming into the water. And I want these directional lines of the marsh to support that. So I'm just trying to get some interesting shapes in the marsh and not repeat the shapes. Okay, so that's pretty good for just giving me an idea on where things are going. So now I'm going to go ahead and put my wash in. And like I said, my palette is Cad Lemon, Yellow Ochre, Venetian Red, and Cobalt Blue. I was actually started a study not using the cadmium lemon, but I thought that really I needed a little bit more light in the sky, so I added the lemon in there. But for the most part, I'm going to be using just a grade yellow, which is ochre, a grade red, which is Venetian red, and cobalt. Okay, so we'll get started here. And this part is really kind of fun, very freeing. I am using a little bit of Neo McGilp to help with the drying time. And this doesn't have to be too thick. I keep it very thin. And I like to use a nice big brush just to get the canvas colored. So this was a toned canvas, and it was toned with just ochre, but very, very thinly. And I don't always do that. I do frequently, especially if I'm going outside where there's a lot of glare, whether it's, you try to keep the sun off your canvas, but there's still so much reflective light around that it helps a lot with the glare. Okay, so I'm using this ochre tone just to basically where the cloud is going to be, because my cloud is going to be lots of purples and blues and rosy tones, so I want a little bit of the warmth to show through. And like I said, this isn't about shape making. That's going to come later. This is more about just kind of placing things. Okay, so now I'm going to use a tone that is pretty much the same value as the, well, that's a little bit too dark. Well, I'm going to tone this in a little bit darker because eventually my cloud is going to be that value. And this is just Cobalt and yellow ochre, and it's still trying to keep it pretty thin with the Neo McGill. And so this will give me a nice base to put the first layer of paint on. And I can kind of check my shapes. And you know, this doesn't have to take a lot of time. Okay, that was a little bit too dark. I wanted to keep it a little bit lighter, so I'm just going to wipe a little bit of that out of there. And you know, a marsh, there's always a lot of low standing water in there, which is what I wanted to portray in this. It's a very low lying area. Okay, so I'm going to feather the edges just a little bit. And I can always take my paper towel and wipe back out if I want to. And what that does right here is that gives me a little bit of basis for the marsh that's going to be reflecting down into the water. Just a little warm undertone. Because all of this, the light is going to be emanating down here, and all of the water over here is going to be in shadow because it's reflecting the cloud. Get rid of some of these lines here, but as you can see, it's already setting up to a certain degree from the Neo McGill. It's really not moving around much at all, which is absolutely fine. That's really where we want it. Okay, so my last passage here is going to be the distant shore. And I've got ochre in here and cobalt, just a little bit more cobalt to kind of cool it off to give it the feel of distance. Okay, so I want a feel of transparency over here, but I want this water in shadow. because it's going to be a dark reflection from the cloud. As is this over here. I'm going to leave that open in the light. And I'm going to, again, like I said, I want to show that it's not light, but I also want the transparency. Okay, for right now, I think that that's, well, let me put a little bit of shadow in here. Transparent. Okay, I think that we'll stop here with the washing, and then our next stage will be to go in and do our first layer of actual paint. So that will be where I really need to make sure that I nail my value and my color based on my previous studies. Okay, so now that we have our toned canvas, and it has set up a little bit because of the neo-McGill and the fact that it's very thinned, I'm going to go ahead and proceed with mixing paint. And like I said, I have a very, very limited palette. The advantage of that is, like, if I'm going to mix up some darks, I don't have 10 choices. I basically have my Cobalt, my Venetian red, and maybe a little bit of ochre. And then I will just proportion them. A cooler dark will have more of the cobalt blue in it, and a warmer one will have more of the Venetian red in it. And so it really makes mixing paint a lot easier because there aren't as many choices. So let's get to it. First, I'm going to mix up the darks. And I've got my Cobalt here with some of my Venetian. And the nice thing about using Venetian is that it's already a grade red. And since I want this painting to be more tonal, that's quite the advantage. I want to mix up nice big piles of paint. And then in this dark, I'm going to have a warmer and a cooler. Now, we really want to be very careful that we nail our values. And so I'm mixing these piles right next to each other so that I can tell if I squint down at them that they are the same value. Okay, so you can see that this one is cooler and this one is warmer. So this has more of the Venetian red in it, and that has more of the Cobalt in it. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my midtones. And here I'm going to probably dip in also to my ochre, but it's going to have all three of the primaries in it, just different proportions of each. Okay, so this midtone, I'm putting a lot of the ochre in it, and that will go more into the marsh. And there's no way using just this limited palette that I will not have color harmony. Okay, so here, using the ochre, the Venetian red, and the Cobalt, I've got one that's a little bit greener and one that's a little bit more yellow. And these are the same value. So that will be a middle tone. And then in the sky, I'm going to mix up some middle tones. One that's going to be a little bit more towards the purple. So here I've got really, really blue there, so I'm putting in my grade red. And maybe a little bit of ochre just to kind of gray it down a bit. And I like that tone there for the cloud. And then I'm going to have the same value, but as we're getting closer to the light source, which in this case is the moon, will be rosier. And it's really good to mix with your palette knife. I think, at least in the beginning, when you're making your puddles of paint, because it goes a lot quicker and you mix up a lot more paint. It's really frustrating when you run out of that particular color and value that you've mixed and you have to stop and remix it. Much more difficult. Okay, this the Venetian too, which is interesting, it's a lot less staining than, say, Cad Red Light. Okay, so that's getting pretty rosy there. So I think that's going to be a nice color. Now I will bend all of these colors with my brush as I'm painting. Some I'll bend cooler, some I'll bend warmer. And so now we have 4 puddles of the mid-tone. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to mix the lightest value, which will be my sky. So with this, I'm going to start with the Cobalt and my lemon yellow. Okay, you can see how limey that is, not exactly a sky color. So we're going to put some white in, and then I'm going to decide where I'm going to go to neutralize that. I'll go to my red, because you know red is the complement of green. Okay, so I'm going to have a gradation in the sky. The highlight, the moon, is going to be popping out here. So as the sky fades off here, it'll be more blue and it'll be cooler down here. So at this point, I'm going to add more cobalt to this and then bring it up to the same value as that lighter green so that I make sure that it's all in the same value range, just cooler. Okay, so we've got a warm and a cool in the sky. So last but not least, I'm going to make up a little highlight color, and I'm going to do that over here near my sky. And I'm going to get some clean white from over here. And that lemon, as you can see, is quite staining. Okay, and now I'm going to dip into my wax and give it a lot of texture. Now, I use wax a lot. I usually don't use it in my darks because I like to keep my darks a little thinner. And I usually use it certainly in the highlights. And I may come back into this and use it in the lighter side of the marsh. But for right now, I'm only going to use the coal wax in the highlight. Hi, I'm Mary Garrish, and welcome to my workshop on design. In this workshop, we will be studying design and the 6 elements of it individually. It's so much easier to break things down and study one thing at a time. I will show you how I do this in my sketchbook. First, we will study line by itself, and then we will come in with value sketches. Once we have worked that through for the design of the painting that I'm going to be showing you today, we will move on to oil painting value studies and then apply that to a limited palette with color studies also. Then we'll move on to the canvas and I will show you texture and edges as we paint the painting. After all of that, I'm going to give you a little surprise at the end, and we're going to scumble a dry painting, and I'll show you the advantages of doing that. What I think is unique about my workshop is actually simplifying things. When we go outside to paint, especially, or even in the studio, making a painting is very, very complicated. And today I'm going to try to break it down and make it simple for you to study. So working on design is the most important thing on the front end of a painting. If you don't have a strong design, it doesn't matter how well you are at executing the painting, it's just not going to work. So I would recommend that you slow down and really study the design of each individual painting before you go to the canvas and proceed to put paint on the canvas. Most of us struggle with design and value. And it's always easier when things are simple to understand them. So in this video, we're going to try to isolate the elements of design to simplify it. And if you study these individually, then it becomes much easier and it becomes a lot of fun. It's really not a lot of fun when you're trying to do 6 things at one time, but when you're doing one thing, you can be very creative in that. And that's actually what our goal is to be creative in our design.
Well, that's a piece of 6 elements of design. You can learn more about Mary Garrish's full-length video at streamline.art. And we have a discount code for you today only in the comments section. Take advantage of that. Now let's get right to our interview with Mary Garrish.
Hi, I'm Mary Garrish, and I'm a landscape painter from Florida. I live on Merritt Island, which is a barrier island near Cocoa Beach, and the north part of our island is where the Space Center is. I've lived in Florida pretty much my entire life, and because of that, I'm really drawn to painting the ocean and marshes and incredible skies. So I came to art as a second career. My first career, I was a physician, and I was very, very happy doing that until I discovered art. And then it was all about how I could find my way to paint full-time because it was just so exhilarating every time you go to the canvas and the exploration that goes on there. So when I was growing up, I was never really exposed to art and really didn't find art until one day my daughter, who was about 5, asked me, "Mommy, can you draw me an animal?" So I tried to draw a pig or a cow or whatever, and as children will, she says to me, "Why do all your animals look the same?" And I'm like, "Well, because I can't draw." So I went and I ordered Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain and Drawing with Children. And when I started to read Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, I realized that it was really just geometry, and I always loved geometry. And so I started taking my first art class. And I started off with pastels, and I just did an art class 3 hours a week for many years. And then one day, I decided to take an intensive art workshop with Scott Christensen. And when I got there, I realized that I probably should not have been there because there were a lot of professional artists in that class, and I kind of just stayed in the back of the class. But what that workshop did for me is it made me realize I really wanted to pursue art as a second career. And I really envied all those people that were painting full-time. At the end of that workshop, Scott asked everybody, where do you want to be in a week, a month, a year, 5 years with your art? And that was when I started to think, you know, I would really like to retire from medicine and start a second career as an artist. And it took me 5 years to get there, but then I finally retired and I'm a full-time artist now, and I'm just extremely grateful. You know, I never really had an aha moment with art, but it was a slow love affair where the more I studied art, the more I fell in love with it. Going to museums and galleries, going to workshops, and it's such an intellectual process. Every painting that you paint is totally different from the painting before, and it's an intellectual challenge each time that I love. So my art education consisted of going to lots of art workshops with teachers that I thought I admired for their process, and I wanted to paint in the same way they did, not like them, but in the same way, maybe towards a more representational painting. I studied with Matt Smith and Kwang Ho and C.W. Mundy, and obviously Scott Christensen, who was my mentor. And last year I took a workshop on abstraction with Larry Moore, and I would highly recommend that. You don't have to want to paint abstractly, but that workshop will help you with your representational painting if that's the way you're painting. I think what I like about art the most is the exploration. And so recently, I have started to explore different palettes, very limited, simplified palettes. And I just do little studies, like maybe 6x8s on, you know, on small little canvases, and just play around with color for color's sake. And that has brought so much joy to me recently. And I'm looking forward to exploring more in that capacity. I think if anybody asked me, I'd say what I'm known for the most are sky paintings. So back before I ever really started painting, when I was just still hobby painting, shall we say, I was enamored by the Florida skies. And our back patio faces west, and so frequently I would go out there and I was taking photographs. And my husband would laugh at me. He says, "Don't you have enough photographs of the sky?" And I'm like, nope, everyone is unique and different. And so I think that was my love affair with skies. That's where it began. I think what I find most difficult about painting landscapes, especially outside, is the fact that you're so limited in time because, you know, the lighting conditions are constantly changing. And that, to me, is the biggest struggle. So what I have started doing, instead of going out to make a painting, I go out to study. And that might be just sketching in my sketchbook. It might be making an oil painting study and using a lot of photographs with that study and notes that I've made about the painting to go back into the studio and try to make a well-designed, successful studio painting. So now my career, it's pretty well balanced, I would say. When I first started painting, my husband bought me all these business of art books, which of course I didn't want to read because I just wanted to paint. But I remember reading one of them, and it was written by an artist. And the artist said that you should spend 30% of your time painting, 30% studying, and 30% marketing. And I was like, well, I just want to spend all my time painting. Well, and at first, until my career got going, you know, I didn't really need any marketing. But then I started getting into galleries and selling my art. And now I understand why they had that division. But I still try to spend less time marketing and much more time studying. I think now I study more than I'm at the easel, quote unquote, making a painting. I might be at the easel studying, but the making the painting has become a lesser portion of my time because I'm really trying to advance my painting. And I think study is extremely important. You know, I think everybody struggles with, should I be doing this? Am I good enough? Am I not good enough? And I've gotten past all of that. When I first started painting, I would apply to art shows and things like that, and I still certainly apply to art shows. But you know, you've got to be used to getting rejected if you're going to be an artist. And it's not really always about you or your painting. There may be thousands of paintings out there. I was actually president of the American Impressionist Society for a number of years, and so I had to do the jury process, and it is extremely difficult. So what I would say to you, yes, apply to shows, but you know, don't let that get you down. Don't let that get you discouraged. You know, go back to the easel. Every failure I have, I think I learn much more from than the paintings that are quote unquote successful. But you have to analyze, why was that not successful? And that's where your greatest growth will come. I think what makes me different from a lot of other artists is that I don't let defeat get me down that much. I might spend a whole day in my studio making a painting and then wipe the thing off. And I'll get up the next day and I'm like, okay, back to the easel, what am I going to paint? When I teach a workshop, I try to keep students engaged and interested in the process by demonstrating in short vignettes different things that they can take home with them and practice. I think making things simple and breaking them down is the easiest way to study. So there was a quote by Alexander Graham Bell that said, the only difference between success and failure is taking action. So take action with your paintings and your study process, and I'll bet you will grow by leaps and bounds.
Well, that's Mary Garrish, 6 Elements of Design. It's a brand new video. You can learn more about the full-length instructional video at streamline.art, and there's a special discount code for you in the comments section today only. Make sure to take advantage of that. Thank you for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes.
Hi, I'm Mary Garrish, and welcome to my workshop on design. In this workshop, we will be studying design and the 6 elements of it individually. It's so much easier to break things down and study one thing at a time. I will show you how I do this in my sketchbook. First, we will study line by itself, and then we will come in with value sketches. Once we have worked that through for the design of the painting that I'm going to be showing you today, we will move on to oil painting value studies, and then apply that to a limited palette with color studies also. Then we'll move on to the canvas, and I will show you texture and edges as we paint the painting. After all of that, I'm going to give you a little surprise at the end, and we're going to scumble a dry painting, and I'll show you the advantages of doing that. What I think is unique about my workshop is actually simplifying things. When we go outside to paint, especially, or even in the studio, making a painting is very, very complicated. And today I'm going to try to break it down and make it simple for you to study. So working on design is the most important thing on the front end of a painting. If you don't have a strong design, it doesn't matter how well you are at executing the painting, it's just not going to work. So I would recommend that you slow down and really study the design of each individual painting before you go to the canvas and proceed to put paint on the canvas. Most of us struggle with design and value, and it's always easier when things are simple to understand them. So in this video, we're going to try to isolate the elements of design to simplify it. And if you study these individually, then it becomes much easier and it becomes a lot of fun. It's really not a lot of fun when you're trying to do 6 things at one time, but when you're doing one thing, you can be very creative in that. And that's actually what our goal is to be creative in our design.